3 true scary stories from police officers, creepy cases, and unsolved mysteries. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of a fan struggling against the summer heat. A single desk lamp cast long, flickering shadows across the cluttered desk, its light barely illuminating the walls adorned with faded newspaper clippings and old case files. The retired officer sat there, fingers tapping rhythmically against a half-empty glass of whiskey, his eyes fixed on a photograph of his younger self in uniform. He had been a proud man then, standing tall beside his patrol car, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. Now, his shoulders sagged under the weight of memories he couldn't escape. People think police work is all about catching bad guys, he began, his gravelly voice cutting through the silence. And sure it is, but they never tell you about the other stuff, the things that keep you up at night, the things that don't add up no matter how many reports you file or how many witnesses you interview. He reached for the glass, taking a slow sip, his gaze distant. There are cases I've worked on that I can explain with evidence, logic, and the law. And then there are the others, cases that stay with you long after the paperwork is done, cases that don't make sense no matter how you look at them. Those are the ones that haunt me. The officer leaned back in his chair, the worn leather creaking beneath him. I've seen things, heard things that no academy could have prepared me for. It's not the criminals or the blood or the fear that sticks with you. It's the unexplainable. The moments when the world doesn't play by the rules, when reality slips, and you find yourself face to face with something you can't define. He paused, his fingers trailing along the rim of the glass. Some nights, I can still hear their voices, the ones who never got justice, the ones who never left. You see, there are stories in this line of work that go beyond the mundane, stories that don't just test your bravery, but your sanity. He leaned forward, his face now cast in half shadow. I want to tell you about those stories. Not because I want to scare you, though they might, but because they're real as you and me sitting here. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the truth, no matter how dark, has a way of finding you. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier with each word. These aren't stories from a movie or a book. These are real cases I worked on, real lives I touched or failed to save. I can't promise you answers, and I won't sugarcoat the horror. But if you're willing to listen, I'll share with you the darkest moments of my career, the ones that still keep me up at night. He extinguished his cigarette in a chipped ashtray, the faint glow fading into nothingness. So, are you ready to hear the truth? Because once you do, there's no going back. The officer's eyes met yours, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing in closer. Then he spoke, his voice a whisper, yet full of weight. Let me take you to the edge of reason, to the moments where ordinary police work meets something far more sinister. Let me show you the stories that don't just haunt me, they define me. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a sense of foreboding. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a police siren echoed, a haunting reminder of the world he once knew and the darkness he could never escape. Story 1. The Phantom Caller. The station was unusually still that night, the kind of stillness that made every small sound, paper rustling, a clock ticking, seem unnaturally loud. Officer Maria leaned back in her chair, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating the scattered paperwork in front of her. It was her third night shift that week, and fatigue was beginning to weigh on her. She reached for her coffee cup, cold now, but still a necessary companion. The police radio crackled to life, breaking the monotony. Maria straightened in her chair, her hand instinctively moving to the receiver. Before she could grab it, the station's landline rang sharply, piercing the quiet. Kingston County Police Department, this is Officer Maria speaking, she answered, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost frantic. Please, someone's in my house. They're trying to get in. Maria's training kicked in. Ma'am, can you tell me your address? It's 42 Maplewood Drive. Please hurry. They're at the window. Oh God, they're inside. The line went dead. Maria's pulse quickened. Grabbing her radio, she called for backup and dispatched 2 officers to the address. She stayed on the line with the responding officers, monitoring their progress. Within 10 minutes, Officer Donnelly and Officer Perez arrived at the scene. "We're at the location," Donnelly reported through the radio. "House looks dark, no visible signs of a break-in." "Proceed with caution," Maria instructed, her voice firm but calm. The officers moved in, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with an unexplainable chill. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like forgotten memories in every corner. It was clear no one had lived there for years. "Maria," Donnelly's voice crackled through the radio, low and hesitant. "This place is a ghost town. No recent activity. Are you sure this is the right address?" "I'm sure," Maria replied, frowning as she double-checked the call log. The caller was adamant. 42 Maplewood Drive. Perez's voice cut in. "Something's not right here. The dust on the floor, it's undisturbed. If someone had been here recently, there'd be footprints. Then they found it. On the kitchen counter sat an old rotary phone, its receiver off the hook, swinging gently as though it had just been placed down. Beside it was a framed photograph, the glass cracked and clouded with grime. Donnelly picked it up, brushing off the dust. It was a family portrait, 2 parents and a young woman. "Maria," Donnelly said, his voice tinged with unease. "You need to hear this. The picture here, it's old, but the woman in it, I swear it matches the description of the caller." Maria felt a cold, not tighten in her stomach. "That's impossible." Perez spoke next, his voice shaking. "We found her ID. The name matches the address. Maria, the woman died 3 years ago in a home invasion. This is her house." Maria's blood ran cold. "What? Are you sure?" Before Donnelly could respond, the radio emitted a high-pitched static, followed by a faint, trembling voice. "They're still here." The officers froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one Maria had heard on the phone earlier. "Who's speaking?" "Identify yourself," Donnelly demanded, his flashlight darting around the room. The lights in the house flickered violently, and a sudden draft swept through the room, carrying with it a faint whisper. Perez turned toward the window, his breath visible in the sudden chill. "Donnelly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The glass, it's frosted, like someone breathed on it." Maria listened helplessly from the station, her hands gripping the radio. "Donnelly, Perez, report back. What's happening?" There was a long pause before Donnelly spoke again, his voice lower now, almost reverent. "We're leaving, Maria. Whatever this is, it's not something we're equipped to handle." The line went dead, leaving Maria in silence. She stared at the phone on her desk, her mind racing. The official report would chalk it up to a prank call, a mix-up, anything but the truth. But she knew better. That night, as she closed up the station, Maria felt the same chill that the officers had described. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she turned instinctively toward the station's door. Outside, the street was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. That was the first night Maria truly understood that some calls weren't meant to be answered. Some voices from the past refused to stay silent. Sleep eluded Maria that night. The eerie call and the cryptic events at 42 Maplewood Drive played on a loop in her mind. As dawn broke, she sat at her desk, sipping her 4th cup of lukewarm coffee, staring at the flickering monitor of her computer. The case file for the deceased homeowner, Elaine Carter, lay open before her. Maria's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed in Carter's name into the police database, pulling up a series of grainy photographs and a sparse report. The details of the murder were chilling. Elaine had been home alone one stormy night when an intruder broke in. The killer left no fingerprints, no clues, just a lifeless body and a trail of unanswered questions. The crime had shaken the small town to its core, but without leads, it had become one of the many cold cases gathering dust in the archives. Maria leaned back, exhaling slowly. Why tonight? She wondered. What had stirred Elaine's spirit to reach out after 3 long years? She clicked on an audio file attached to the case, a recording of Elaine's 911 call on the night of her murder. Maria adjusted her headphones and pressed play. The voice on the recording was frantic, trembling with fear. Please, someone's in my house. They're trying to get in. Oh God, they're inside. Maria froze. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization washed over her. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same one she had heard hours earlier. Her hands trembled as she replayed the recording. There was no doubt about it. Elaine Carter had somehow called the station from beyond the grave. Compelled to dig deeper, Maria pored over every detail of the case. She discovered a list of suspects questioned at the time of the murder, but none had led to any charges. Among them was the name Daniel Haynes, a local drifter arrested the same night for an unrelated burglary a few blocks away. He had been released for lack of evidence, his alibi corroborated by a dubious friend. The file offered little else, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that Haynes wasn't a mere coincidence. As fatigue finally caught up to her, Maria dozed off at her desk. Her dreams were vivid and unsettling. She found herself standing in the middle of Elaine's abandoned house, the air thick with an unplaceable tension. The rotary phone on the kitchen counter began to ring, the sound sharp and jarring. Maria hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. When she finally picked it up, the voice on the other end was clear, almost calm. "Find him," Elaine's voice whispered. "His name is Haynes." Maria jolted awake, her heart pounding. The dream was unlike any she'd had before, too vivid, too real to dismiss. She stared at the name on the suspect list, Daniel Haynes. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, Maria began digging into Haynes's past. It didn't take long to find a pattern of petty crimes, most involving break-ins. What caught her attention, however, was the timing. Haynes had been arrested for a string of burglaries in the months leading up to Elaine's murder, but had always managed to slip through the cracks. She found an address tied to him in a neighboring town. Grabbing her jacket and badge, Maria decided to follow the lead. When she arrived, the dilapidated apartment complex was a stark contrast to the quiet suburbs of Kingston County. Maria approached the door marked 5B, her instincts warning her to stay alert. She knocked firmly, her other hand resting on her holstered firearm. The man who opened the door was gaunt, with deep-set eyes and an air of unease. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Daniel Haynes?" Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. He nodded. "I'm Officer Maria with Kingston County PD. I'd like to ask you a few questions about a case." Haynes's face twitched, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. "I don't know anything about any case," he muttered, attempting to close the door. Maria stepped forward, her tone firm. "This isn't going away, Mr. Haynes. Elaine Carter's murder may be a cold case to some, but not to me." At the mention of Elaine's name, Haynes froze. His knuckles whitened against the doorframe, and Maria saw a glint of fear in his eyes. "Look, I didn't mean for it to happen," he blurted, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to scare her, to grab some cash and go. She wasn't supposed to fight back." The confession spilled out in a torrent, years of guilt and fear unraveling in seconds. Maria's breath hitched, a mixture of relief and horror washing over her. "You're under arrest," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling within her. As she cuffed him and called for backup, Maria couldn't shake the image of Elaine's face from the photograph at the crime scene. Somehow, against all logic and reason, Elaine had found a way to ensure justice was served. That night, as Maria filed her report, the phone on her desk rang again. For a split second, she hesitated before picking it up. "Officer Maria," she said. There was no response, just a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Thank you." The line went dead, leaving Maria in silence. She leaned back in her chair, a small, bittersweet smile on her lips. Some cases, it seemed, refused to stay closed. Story 2. The Drawing Killer. The precinct buzzed with activity, the chatter of officers and the distant ringing of phones blending into a low hum. At the center of the chaos sat a man in his mid-40s, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm surrounding him. His name was Raymond Kell, but the media had christened him the Drawing Killer. Detective Liam Harper studied Kell through the observation window. The man sat with an unnerving stillness, his hands resting on the steel table, a faint smile playing on his lips. Kell had been arrested mere hours ago, caught fleeing the scene of his latest atrocity. Inside the victim's apartment, they had found a signature, a charcoal sketch left on the coffee table. The drawing was haunting, a precise depiction of the murder scene, complete with the victim's lifeless form and the exact positioning of every piece of furniture. The level of detail was unnerving, as if Kel had recreated the scene from memory. Ready for this? Harper's partner, Detective Elena Ruiz, asked as she handed him a cup of coffee. As I'll ever be, Harper replied, his eyes never leaving Kel. The interrogation room door creaked open as they entered. Kel's smile widened, his eyes glinting with something that felt like amusement. Detectives, he greeted, his voice smooth and unsettlingly polite. I was wondering when you'd join me. Let's cut to the chase, Ruiz said, sitting across from him. We know you killed Amanda Price. The sketch is all we need to convict you. Kel chuckled softly. Ah yes, Amanda. A tragic end, but such a beautiful scene, don't you think? Art is about capturing truth, and death is the truest moment of all. Harper leaned forward, his tone sharp. This isn't art, Kel. These are people's lives. Kel tilted his head, his smile never wavering. Do you believe in fate, Detective Harper? In the inevitability of certain events? Ruiz exchanged a glance with Harper, her unease mirrored in his expression. I see things, Kel continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Moments that are meant to happen. I simply record them. From his pocket, Kel produced a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table, his movements slow and deliberate. Ruiz unfolded it cautiously, her breath catching as she took in the sketch. It was another murder scene, as detailed and chilling as the others. But this one was different. It hadn't happened yet. The victim was a young man, his lifeless body slumped against a graffitied wall in an alleyway. The date scrawled at the bottom of the page was tomorrow. This is some sick game, Harper said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. You're trying to manipulate us. Am I? Kel's smile widened. Check the details. The location, the markings on the wall. Tell me I'm lying. The detectives left the room, the sketch clutched tightly in Ruiz's hand. They pulled up street camera footage from the area depicted in the drawing, cross-referencing the graffiti against known locations. Their stomachs sank when they found it. An alley off 5th Street, the graffiti a perfect match to the one in Kel's sketch. How could he know this? Ruiz muttered. That graffiti's fresh. It wasn't there last week. Harper rubbed his temples, the weight of the case pressing down on him. We can't ignore this. We'll stake out the alley, and if he's pulling some kind of stunt, we'll catch him in the act. That night, Harper and Ruiz waited in a surveillance van parked near the alley. The air was thick with tension, every shadow and sound setting their nerves on edge. Hours passed, the city quieting as the clock crept toward midnight. Just as Harper began to doubt Kel's claims, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a young man, matching the sketch's description. He seemed disoriented, glancing over his shoulder as if being followed. Before Harper could process what was happening, another figure appeared, a knife glinting in their hand. Go! Harper shouted, leaping from the van. The scene unfolded in a chaotic blur. The detectives tackled the assailant before they could strike, their shouts echoing off the alley walls. The young man, though shaken, was unharmed. As the officers cuffed the would-be killer, Ruiz glanced around the alley. Her blood ran cold when she noticed the scene's eerie resemblance to Kel's sketch, right down to the position of the young man against the wall. Back at the precinct, Kel waited patiently in the interrogation room, his smile as steady as ever. When Harper and Ruiz confronted him, his only response was a soft, knowing laugh. Did I not say it was fate? He asked, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. The detectives left the room, their minds racing with questions. How could Kel have known the exact details of a crime that hadn't yet occurred? Was he orchestrating events, or was there something far more sinister at play? The unanswered questions lingered, casting a shadow over the precinct as the night stretched on. The precinct was abuzz with tension as Detective Liam Harper and his partner, Detective Elena Ruiz, stood before a corkboard crowded with sketches. Each one depicted a murder in haunting detail, some already solved, others still under investigation. But the latest sketch, delivered by the enigmatic Raymond Kell, loomed over them like a dark prophecy. The sketch showed the precinct building engulfed in flames. In the foreground, shadowy figures resembling officers flailed amid the inferno. Harper's chest tightened every time he looked at it. "We've got less than 24 hours until the date on this one," Ruiz said, her voice strained. "We can't sit on our hands." Kell, locked in a holding cell down the hall, had remained eerily composed since his arrest. He offered no explanations for how he created the sketches or why their grim events seemed to materialize with uncanny precision. Harper ran his hands through his hair. "The precinct sketch doesn't make sense. He's locked up. What's he going to do? Burn the place down from inside a cell?" "That's the thing," Ruiz countered. "He hasn't been wrong yet." The team split up to investigate leads tied to other sketches Kell had provided. One depicted a brutal stabbing at a downtown cafe. Harper and Ruiz coordinated a stakeout, positioning plainclothes officers throughout the area. Hours passed in tense anticipation until a man matching the suspect's description entered the cafe. Harper and Ruiz moved swiftly, arresting the man before he could act. But their victory was short-lived. No weapon was found, and there was no evidence linking the suspect to any crime. The cafe staff even vouched for his innocence, stating he was a regular customer. Tensions within the team began to fray. Ruiz slammed a folder onto her desk. "We're chasing shadows. Kell's playing us, and we're falling for it." Harper leaned against the wall, staring at the precinct sketch. "If this guy's a fraud, then how do you explain?" He trailed off, pointing to the board. They were interrupted by a rookie officer bursting into the room, pale-faced and trembling. "Detectives, there's smoke coming from the holding area." They raced down the corridor, alarms blaring as a faint haze spread through the precinct. Kell's cell was at the epicenter. Firefighters arrived quickly, extinguishing the blaze before it could spread. The damage was contained, but the scene inside the cell left Harper and Ruiz reeling. Kell was dead. His body was slumped against the wall, charred but eerily intact. The origin of the fire was unclear. No accelerants, no electrical malfunctions. It was as if the flames had erupted out of nowhere. Ruiz examined the remains of Kell's belongings. Among them was a notebook filled with sketches, most of them smeared and illegible from the heat. One drawing, however, was untouched. It showed Kell himself, burning inside the very cell where he now lay dead. Harper's hands shook as he held the sketch. "He knew," he whispered. "Maybe he planned it," Ruiz replied, though her voice lacked conviction. As the team sifted through the aftermath, Harper couldn't shake a gnawing unease. Kell had been behind bars when the fire started. There was no logical explanation for how the events unfolded, or how his sketches continued to predict the future with such chilling accuracy. Later that night, as Harper reviewed the case file, he noticed something he hadn't before. On the back of the precinct sketch, faint markings were etched into the paper. It was a cryptic series of numbers and letters, almost like coordinates. Ruiz appeared at his side, holding 2 cups of coffee. "What's that?" Harper tapped the markings. "I think it's a message, and I don't think Kell was working alone." The words hung heavy between them. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, the storm mirroring the turmoil brewing within the precinct. Though Kell was dead, the mystery surrounding him was far from over. Harper and Ruiz couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something far darker and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Story 3. The Station's Curse. The newly built police station in Cedar Hollow was a beacon of modern efficiency. Towering over the small, remote town, it gleamed with fresh paint and pristine hallways. For the officers who had worked in the cramped, crumbling building downtown, it was a welcome upgrade, or so they thought. Officer Jake Sullivan was on duty the evening the last remnants of the old station were delivered. Among the cargo was an old, battered trunk. Its leather was cracked and worn, the brass fittings tarnished with age. A faded tag dangled from the handle, the words "Unsolved case files" scrawled in blocky handwriting. "Finally," muttered Sullivan, dragging it into the evidence room. The trunk groaned ominously as it was set down. By the time Sullivan locked up for the night, He couldn't shake an odd feeling, like he was being watched. Dismissing it as exhaustion, he headed home. That night, the station began to change. Officer Linda Ramirez was the first to notice. On her midnight shift, she returned to her desk to find her papers scattered across the floor. Assuming it was the wind from an open window, she sighed and bent to retrieve them, only to hear a faint, unmistakable whisper. "Leave!" She froze. The room was empty. The air was still. The whisper came again, closer this time, though the words were distorted as if spoken underwater. Linda bolted to the break room, her pulse racing. By the next morning, word of strange occurrences had spread. Lights flickered unpredictably. The station's state-of-the-art security cameras glitched, showing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures. Items went missing, only to reappear in bizarre locations. Handcuffs found in the ceiling tiles, a coffee mug inexplicably sitting atop the flagpole. Lieutenant Mark Travers called a meeting to address the rumors. "Listen up, everyone," he said, his tone firm. "I don't want to hear any more talk about ghosts or curses. This is a brand new building. If you've got real concerns, file a report. Otherwise, let's focus on the job." Despite his reassurances, Travers himself was uneasy. The whispers had followed him home the night before. The situation escalated when Officer Ryan Cho, a skeptic who openly mocked the idea of hauntings, began having vivid nightmares. He dreamed of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed, its face obscured but its presence suffocating. The figure didn't speak, but its intentions were clear. It pointed to the trunk. The dreams became nightly occurrences for Cho, and soon, others, Ramirez, Sullivan, and even Travers began to experience the same figure in their sleep, each time with increasing clarity. One particularly harrowing night, Ramirez woke with scratches across her arm. She stared at the marks in disbelief. The scratches formed a word, "open." Compelled by fear and curiosity, the officers decided to examine the trunk more closely. Ramirez, Sullivan, and Cho gathered in the evidence room late one night, their nerves on edge. The trunk creaked as they unlatched it, its hinges groaning like a dying breath. Inside was a collection of old case files, each yellowed with age. At first, the contents seemed unremarkable: reports, photographs, and evidence bags. Then they found it. At the bottom of the trunk was a single black envelope, sealed with a thick, waxy substance. Ramirez picked it up, her hand trembling. As she turned it over, she noticed a name scrawled in faded ink. Eleanor Reed. "Who's Eleanor Reed?" Cho asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sullivan frowned, rifling through the files. "I don't see anything about her in these cases." Ramirez's unease deepened. "If she's not part of these cases, why is her name here?" They agreed to search the station's database, but as they turned to leave, the lights flickered violently. A chilling wind swept through the room, slamming the trunk shut with a deafening thud. The shadowy figure from their dreams appeared briefly in the corner, its presence so oppressive that all three officers were frozen in place. Then just as suddenly, it vanished. From that moment on, they knew they were dealing with something far more sinister than a few unsolved cases. The trunk had brought more than just files to their news station. It had brought a curse. The whispers grew louder. The nightmares became unbearable, and the name Eleanor Reed lingered like a poison in their minds. Who was she, and what did she want? The answers lay buried in the trunk, but unlocking its secrets might come at a price none of them were willing to pay. The atmosphere at Cedar Hollow Police Station grew heavier with each passing day. The sleek, modern building now felt oppressive, its bright halls dimmed by an unseen presence. The officers tried to ignore it, chalking the strange occurrences up to stress or imagination. But denial could only last so long. The first undeniable proof came from the station's security cameras. Late one evening, Officer Linda Ramirez sat in the surveillance room, monitoring the live feeds. The screens showed empty hallways, the parking lot, and the holding cells, each area bathed in the pale glow of fluorescent lights. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her eyelids, when movement caught her eye. On the screen displaying the evidence room, a shadow flickered in the corner. Linda leaned forward, squinting at the screen. The shadow grew, shifting and twisting as though it were alive. For a moment, it took a humanoid shape, a towering figure with no discernible features. Then in an instant, it was gone. Her breath hitched, and she rewound the footage, but the shadow didn't reappear. She called Officer Jake Sullivan to the surveillance room, her voice shaking as she described what she'd seen. "You're imagining things," Sullivan said, but his tone lacked conviction. He had seen enough strange occurrences in the station to know better. That night, the footage was reviewed by other officers. The figure didn't appear in the playback. It was as if the station itself was erasing evidence of its own haunting. The phenomena worsened. Officer Ryan Cho, who had been vocal in his skepticism, was the first to leave. He didn't give notice or pack his belongings. He simply disappeared. His patrol car was found abandoned on the side of the highway, the driver's seat inexplicably soaked with water despite no rain in the area. Other officers began falling ill. Fevers, headaches, and inexplicable fatigue swept through the department. Those who stayed reported hearing whispers in their ears, their own names spoken in tones that ranged from pleading to malicious. By the end of the month, half the staff had quit. Those who remained worked in pairs, unwilling to patrol the station alone. One evening, Lieutenant Mark Travers decided to confront the source of the disturbance. He and Ramirez returned to the evidence room, determined to reopen the cursed trunk. "Whatever's in there, it's driving us out of our minds," Travers said as he pried the trunk open. Inside, everything appeared as it had before. The faded files, the black envelope. But this time Ramirez noticed something new. A folder tucked beneath the other documents, its edges yellowed and worn. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling. The label read, "Officer David Langford, case closed. Travail fourni." David Langford? I've heard that name before. He was killed on duty, wasn't he? Ramirez nodded, flipping through the file. It says he was ambushed while investigating a string of robberies. The suspect was never caught. The file contained photographs of the crime scene. Langford's patrol car riddled with bullet holes, his blood staining the pavement. But there was one photo that sent chills down Ramirez's spine. It showed Langford's badge, left at the scene. Scribbled across the badge in what appeared to be blood were the words, "No justice." That night, the haunting escalated to its breaking point. The remaining officers gathered in the briefing room, discussing their next steps. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. A cold wind swept through the station, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The officers froze, their flashlights darting toward the sound. The shadowy figure from their dreams materialized in the doorway. It loomed taller than any man, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. For the first time, the figure moved, stepping closer. "Who are you?" Travers demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it pointed toward the evidence room. Summoning what little courage they had left, the officers followed. The figure led them to the cursed trunk. It hovered above the open trunk for a moment before dissipating into the air. As the officers approached, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the air thickening like a tangible force. Inside the trunk, the folder on Officer Langford began to glow faintly. "It's him," Ramirez whispered. "The shadow. It's Langford." The realization hit them all at once. Langford's spirit had been trapped, his death unresolved, and his killer never brought to justice. The cursed trunk, filled with unsolved cases, had become his prison. In the following days, the remaining officers worked tirelessly to reopen Langford's case. They uncovered new evidence, connecting a suspect who had slipped through the cracks years earlier. With this discovery, they finally brought Langford's killer to justice. On the day of the arrest, the haunting ceased. The whispers stopped, the lights stabilized, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The station, however, was forever changed. No one could forget the shadowy figure or the torment it had brought. For Ramirez and the others, the trunk was a reminder that justice delayed was justice denied, and that some spirits would not rest until their stories were told. The trunk was sealed and moved to an archive far from Cedar Hollow. But even then, whispers followed. Wherever it went, the legend of the cursed trunk grew. warning those who encountered it of the price of leaving the past unresolved. As the dim glow of the desk lamp flickered to life, the retired officer leaned back in the worn chair, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the case, files scattered before him. Years of police work, years of dark nights and colder cases, had led him here, reflecting on the unsolved, the supernatural, and the lingering shadows of the past. He glanced at the shelves that lined the office, filled with dusty case notes and unmarked folders, each one a small testament to the horrors that had once been his life's work. "You might think," he began, his voice low and gravelly, "that after all these years, after seeing so much, you learn to accept the boundaries of what you can explain. But there are cases that never make it to the final page. Cases where reason is replaced by something far darker." He paused, his thoughts drifting back to the stories he had pieced together over the years, stories that had never quite let him go. 3 haunting tales, each with its own chilling mark on the past, had now converged under his watchful eyes. These weren't just stories. They were warnings, cryptic symbols of something much deeper. The officer thought about Maria and the phantom caller who had reached across time, trapped in an echo of violence, unable to move on. She had discovered the truth, yes, but at what cost? The bitter taste of unfinished business lingered long after the case had been closed, and Maria's mind was never quite the same. The voice, that eerie connection between the past and the present, reminded him that sometimes the dead are just waiting for someone to hear them, to tell their stories before they slip into oblivion. And then there was the drawing killer, the terrifying vision of a mind that seemed to predict the future with every sketch it drew. Those images weren't just art. They were blueprints of murder, and each stroke led the detectives closer to a truth they couldn't escape. He thought of the fire, the one depicted in the final sketch, the destruction that seemed inevitable and yet preventable. The killer had died before the flames could consume the precinct, but was his end truly the end? Could someone who had painted the future be truly gone? It seemed impossible to know. The officer then thought back to the cursed trunk, the haunted relic that had followed the police station to its new home. The officer had never believed in ghosts, not truly, but the events surrounding the trunk had changed him. The shadowy figure that stalked the officers, the mysterious disappearances, the way the past bled into the present. How could any of that be explained away by simple logic? The unresolved murder of Officer Langford, left to fester in the depths of a forgotten case file, cost more than just his life. It had left a scar on the very soul of the station, on those who had dared to uncover the truth. They say that ghosts are born from unfinished business, from guilt and regret. But what happens when those ghosts are human? What happens when the weight of their suffering becomes something the living cannot escape? As the officer closed the final folder, the case now long cold, he let out a long sigh. It had been years since he had last worked with these files. And yet, as he looked back over the pages, it was as if time itself hadn't passed at all. The victims, the killers, the people lost to the shadows, they all seemed as real to him now as they had been the night he first encountered them. But the most chilling thought of all, the one that had stayed with him through the years, was this: some cases never close. Not on paper, not in the files, and certainly not in our minds. For the officer, the lines between justice and the supernatural had blurred long ago. He'd seen too much to simply dismiss the unexplained. Too many cases had left their mark on him. Too many had lingered, refusing to fade into history. The past, it seemed, was always just a breath away, always just behind the veil of everyday life. The victims of these cases had their voices, their stories, their demands for justice. But even as their killers were found, even as mysteries were solved, the officer knew that justice wasn't always so clear-cut. Sometimes, the resolution was merely the end of one chapter in a story that would never truly be finished. The ghosts of the past would continue to haunt the present, leaving their fingerprints on the world long after the case files were closed. As he sat there in the silence of his office, the weight of years of experiences pressing down on him, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows he had once chased were now chasing him. And perhaps, in the end, that was the lesson: the past doesn't just fade away. It lingers. It watches. And for those who spend their lives in the pursuit of truth, the line between the living and the dead becomes thinner, more fragile, until one day, it breaks completely. With that thought, the officer turned off the desk lamp and left the room, the darkness swallowing him whole. But as the door closed behind him, a whisper echoed in the silence, a voice from the past, soft but unmistakable. "I'm still here."